Hi guys, we now start the first subtopic of the fifth chapter of the book India That is Bharat by Sai Deepak, and it's called Decolonial, not Post-Colonial. Be it an individual or a society, neither must cede or surrender the inherent and fundamental right to self-definition or self-determination to an external entity. To give up this most intimate form of agency is to externalize the locus of one's consciousness and its most tangible outward manifestation, identity. This alienation then takes a life of its own, and it's extremely difficult to reverse and reclaim. However, no matter how arduous the process of reclamation, no self-respecting society has the option of lacking or losing the will to take back its right to define the self. What would be worse is for a society to believe that it is better off living in the yawning shadow of a contemptuously overwritten version of itself by another. This is because it would signify a complete and utter failure to not only understand the value of the right to self-definition, but also everything else of value that emanates from it. From the point of view of former colonies, the framework that facilitates a more rounded and complete reclamation of their agency over their consciousness, sans coloniality, is the one that is most suited for their re-emergence. It is for this reason that the decolonial school merits consideration, since identification of coloniality by Aníbal Quijano represents one of the most significant contributions to understanding the cause underlying the cause. Wow, what a beautiful line. Identification of coloniality by Aníbal Quijano represents one of the most significant contributions to understanding the cause underlying the cause, namely European coloniality and its continuing after effects. In other words, decolonial thought appears to have understood the motivation underlying European colonialism better than the other schools of thought, as reflected by the discussion undertaken in the previous chapters. The idea of coloniality is what distinguishes the decolonial from the old post-colonial school, because it encapsulates a grand unified theory of sorts within itself that explains the mental constitution of the colonizer. It necessarily leads to a line of enquiry that examines the very OET framework upon which the colonial edifice rested. OET meaning ontological, epistemological and theological. It necessarily leads to a line of enquiry that examines the very OET framework upon which the colonial edifice rested, and allows us to form and follow the pattern of thought which manifested itself consistently regardless of the nationality of the European colonizer or the geography of colonization. Yes, that's what I was saying in the beginning in the earlier videos, that if you read anything written by the decolonial scholars from Latin America, from Caribbean areas and from Africa, you will notice that they are never talking about India, but it seems like they are talking about India. Word for word, analysis to analysis, everything they say seems to be applicable to India. That is because of the similar patterns applied by the colonizer everywhere, even though they didn't have the same results. Critically, it enables us to see through the coloniality of contemporary structures, having recognized the tendency of the colonizer to obsessively universalize the European provincial worldview through secularization. Decoloniality steers clear of the same mistakes and instead believes in a pluriversal approach, thereby enabling the coexistence of diverse subjectivities. In contrast, post-colonial thought does not engage in the deconstruction of the colonizer's colonial consciousness, but merely questions the fairness of the colonizer's treatment of indigenous societies and registers its objection to the imposition of Eurocentrism on the colonized. While the postmodern foundations of post-colonialism translate to an irreverent challenge to Eurocentric modernity, both the language and terms of challenge are rooted in Europeanism. Starting from an understanding of time and history, post-colonial thought, while rejecting the claims of the colonizer, draws liberally from his OET to view indigenous histories and succumbs to the Christian European trait of universalization of a particular worldview. In other words, post-colonialism is oblivious to its subliminal acceptance of coloniality through its own version of coloniality, which results in what is at best a critical study of the atrocities and impact of colonialism, but not an examination of its undergirding. While it challenges While it challenges colonial authority, it falls significantly short of providing an alternative rooted in indigeneity that can facilitate its reclamation, and that is why post-colonialism has failed to do anything substantive. While it challenges colonial authority, it falls significantly short of providing an alternative rooted in indigeneity. Because their solutions have not been rooted in indigeneity, therefore every problem that they have diagnosed, they have only diagnosed them, they have never solved them. It falls significantly short of providing an alternative rooted in indigeneity that can facilitate its reclamation. Also, post-colonialism fails to recognize the omnipresence of coloniality in contemporary structures and relationships, which explains its post as well as highlights its limitation in empowering indigeneity. After all, how can it offer a solution to a problem it is oblivious to? In terms of timelines, while post-colonialism focuses mostly on the 18th century and thereafter, that is, from the Enlightenment onward, decoloniality pushes it further back to the 15th century, starting with Columbus's expedition of 1492, which it believes to be the beginning of the age of discovery, and therefore of colonization and evangelization. Post-colonial critique is typically associated with Bharat and Palestine, whereas decoloniality is traced to Latin America. Post-colonialism unconsciously accepts the West's conception and monopolization of time and subjectivity, whereas decoloniality rejects this monopoly because it explicitly believes in the coexistence of multiple subjectivities. The former is unable to see, which the latter does, that Western imperialism flows from the same fount of coloniality. It is for these reasons that scholars believe that post-colonial critique is itself in dire need of a decolonial approach. Decoloniality, according to Walter D. Mignolo, is a political project which recognizes that coloniality, modernity, and rationality are inseparable, and therefore the relevance of decoloniality is determined by the presence or absence of coloniality. Its response to the modernity-rationality complex is indigeneity, subjectivity, and relationality. The primary goal of decoloniality, according to Quijano, is epistemological decolonization. What a beautiful concept. The primary goal of decoloniality, according to Quijano, is epistemological decolonization, to enable a new form of intercultural communication. Simply put, it seeks to release production of knowledge from the stranglehold of the West, which could lead to greater diversity of thought and subjectivity, in particular resurgence and re-existence of indigenous perspectives, which Quijano and Mignolo also refer to as epistemic reconstitution. This translates to relocation of the geography and biography of knowledge to native peoples who are best placed to address their own vulnerabilities instead of having to operate within the Eurocentric universalist lines painted by the colonizer. Among other things, this requires indigenous societies to question the European paradigm of rationality that is predicated on Cartesian dualism, since it informs perhaps the most important aspect of Western civilization, namely its approach to nature, and hence to non-Christian cultures. This subject-object lens of Cartesian dualism has affected the crucial disciplines of anthropology and ethnology, thereby reducing the people of the non-West to the status of objects of study. While recognizing the totalizing and totalitarian nature of coloniality, decoloniality does not reject the idea of totality in its entirety. Instead, it posits that the scope of colonial totality must be restricted to the European community, with the intent of liberating the production of knowledge in the rest of the world from the European complex. This is because it recognizes that every culture's vision includes a perspective of totality. However, what distinguishes indigenous perspectives from the European is that the former's vision accommodates and acknowledges the desirability of heterogeneity and diversity, whereas the latter insists on homogeneity, which is traceable to its Christianoity. This insatiable need of European colonizer to homogenize and standardize, inspired by religious and hence racial supremacism, even distinguishes European colonialism from pre-Christian Roman imperialism, which brings out in stark relief the coloniality of European Christian colonization. In other words, diversity of thought and experience perhaps found greater acceptance under pre-Christian Roman imperialism than under European colonialism, which is attributable to the latter's Christian character.